Happy New Year to everyone online, and that Beth and I are feel tremendously privileged and very excited about the Fulbright Arctic Initiative 3. And so what we're hoping to do today is looking at this world. Obviously, we've gone through a horrendous time though over the past year. Everybody's gone through that because of COVID-19, and there have been some enormous international unique experiences, I would say, over the last 4 years, especially with the winding down of the current United States administration, which has also put in some dynamics and challenges that have been unique globally and indeed in the Arctic. But notwithstanding those kind of health challenges that are COVID has presented to us, notwithstanding some of the international relations challenges we've all experienced globally, and also the climate change issue that's confronting humanity globally, and the efforts by countries around the world to get to a zero carbon future. We think there's a lot to learn from the Arctic, and we want to get beyond what you might call Arctic exceptionalism and thinking about some of the lessons from the Arctic that might be worthwhile exploring and sharing in other parts of the world. So that's what the aim of our talk will be today. So I'm going to just flip to the share screen, and hopefully this all comes together. Let's see here. There it does. A world in transition, facing the challenges of sustainability and lessons from the Arctic. So, what is the road forward to address some of these pressing global challenges? And I say, when I look at climate change and a zero carbon future, international cooperation, pandemics, and of course the role of community health, which Elizabeth is, of course, a world expert in. And so we're going to share some of our thoughts on that with you all today. One of the interesting things, the picture you see there is actually Fire Island, just off of Anchorage. And the wind turbines there are owned by Cook Inlet Regional CIRI, which is Native Alaskan owned regional corporation, which actually generates electricity from renewable energy from wind turbines and is sold onto right across from the island to Anchorage to the local power utility. And I capture this because one of the most fascinating things that's going on in the Arctic is actually a global leader that can help provide some very critical lessons in terms of getting to a zero carbon future and the whole energy transition. And there's three elements of that I think are worth noting. One is the strength of energy cooperatives and why those might provide useful lessons globally. Microgrids and the advances that are made in microgrids in Arctic regions. And then, of course, renewable energy integration, both at the local level and in microgrids where there's off-grid communities or communities that are not tied to regional or national grids, or as well as the energy integration for those that are on regional grids. And I think the Arctic provides tremendous lessons for the rest of the world. And if we look at this map here, is actually produced under the Fulbright Arctic Initiative 1 with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and other colleagues from the FAA-1 cohort. And when you look around this from the bird's eye down on the circumpolar map, and you see all those red dots on the map, what you're actually seeing here are communities that are not connected to any national grid. There's no transmission lines going to these communities. And across Canada, Alaska, and Russia, and Greenland, coastal Greenland, of course, there's a high percentage of communities. And if you look at Canada, for example, there's well over 200 communities that are off-grid communities. And then when you look at the percentage, though, of those communities that are Indigenous, Indigenous people make up 5% of off-grid communities, but 50% of 5% of the Canadian population, but 50% of the off-grid communities. And we see a very similar pattern across Russia and, of course, all of Greenland. You see these darker areas where my mouse is going over are regional grids, again, are not tied to national grids or North American or European continental grids. You look at Scandinavia, of course, everybody's grid tied. But these provide enormous challenges. And why the lessons from the Arctic are so important. When you look at global humanity, we have about 1 billion people that do not have electricity now, have no electricity whatsoever, and roughly another billion that are on weak ties, either weak tied electrical systems or are islanded. And these are enormous challenges because electricity is so deadly important to healthcare services, education provision, building a modern economy. So how do you do it in these kind of conditions? And this is where the lessons, several lessons around integration of renewable energy to get to a global zero carbon future are so important. And one is cooperatives. Many of these communities are small. In places like Alaska, for instance, have been very successful. The Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, Native Alaskan owned, been operating since 1967. And that one is the largest by area of any electricity cooperative in the world. And what they do is actually pool resources collectively, technical resources, financial resources, expertise. And that enables small communities that may only have several hundred people to actually own and operate their own utility within this cooperative model. It also provides the wherewithal and the technical expertise to integrate renewable energy in communities that have diesel generation sets to produce local electricity. And we actually have instances now in Alaska where there's a couple of communities that have been able to achieve on many days throughout the year 100% of their electricity from renewable energy. And why this is so deadly important is renewable energy, almost by definition, is local energy. And so it heightens energy security. So communities are not dependent on diesel fuel imports. They can rely on local energy sources, whether it's wind, solar, run-of-river, biomass, what have you. And the Arctic provides vital lessons for other parts of the world, whether it be in Nepal, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Chiloé or southern parts of Latin America. And I think there's a very great value in terms of connecting up the lessons of the Arctic in renewable integration, cooperative models of ownership and management, and microgrid technologies that have been highly successful in the Arctic to other parts of the world. The other area I think is that the Arctic provides to shift away from the energy transition and climate change is in the area of international cooperation. And we've seen that ebb and flow, of course, whether it's in Europe, Ukraine, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's on the Arabian Peninsula. Around the world, we've seen numerous areas of significant challenges around peace and security. But one of the remarkable things that the Arctic has to offer is how different countries with different histories, legacies, and sometimes in direct geopolitical competition, as we saw during the Cold War between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and in certain degrees, we have continuing tensions, of course, with countries of the Western Alliance and Russia, and those ebb and flow at times. But through it all, we've been able to actually manage some very important and profound cooperation that keeps going, notwithstanding what else other might be happening among these relations. In a remarkable story in this continuity of international cooperation among the 8 Arctic states, it has to be first and foremost with Indigenous peoples. And when we look at the post-Second World War period, it's really Indigenous organizations, whether it's the Inuit Circumpolar Council, whether it's the Sami Council, that have been able to be critical bridges in paradiplomacy, where they've forged ongoing relationships for more than half a century now, across Scandinavia into Russia, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, of course, Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Russia. And that kind of leadership and these cultural exchanges have been a bedrock, which has enabled other forms of regional cooperation to emerge. In the Euro Barents, that Arctic region that again encompasses northern Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden in particular, and the Baltic area, and including Northwest Russia, has been ongoing. So even though there have been times where there may be another 4 political challenges among states, at the local level through cultural exchanges, economic exchanges between municipalities. If you go to Eastern Finnmark in the most northerly eastern part of Norway, it's a buzzing hub of cooperation between Russia and Norway. And I think those models of inter-regional cooperation, indigenous paradiplomacy, have been vitally important to keep enhancing peace and security. And these were foundational, frankly, for the emergence of the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council itself is a body that provides a model globally of how you can have interstate cooperation, as well as indigenous peoples in their own right sitting at the table with states discussing. And in the case of indigenous peoples, though they don't have a vote in Arctic Council, they have a seat on it, participate in all the working of it, and have an enormous influence over the lives and fate of peoples in the Arctic. And one of the big things that the Arctic Council has managed to do highly successfully is to work in areas of sustainability. And that is proven to be a critical glue as we look at moving from environmental pollutants to the issue of climate change, which of course is a global issue. And I think that kind of model of the Arctic Council is something, again, the Arctic can export as a critical model. So those are 2 areas that I thought worth exploring of lessons in these times of a bit of turmoil globally, that the Arctic actually has tried and proven. They aren't experimental, they're tried and true ways we can actually move forward globally. And at this point, I'm going to turn the table over to my colleague, Beth.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Rink, and I'm the other co-lead scholar for the 3rd cohort of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And as Michael Haas said, I was a scholar in the 2nd cohort of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And the image model you're seeing here of the iceberg is a product from the 2nd cohort of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And in that program, we are put into groups. And my group was the Thriving Communities group. And so our group focused on health and across the Arctic, and where we thought there were current gaps and where we needed to continue into the future to continue to improve health and transition Arctic indigenous communities to being sustainable. And so if you look at this iceberg, you'll see at the top the monitoring and assessment. And that's really where the focus has been in research, health research in the Arctic. We are very good at our Arctic epidemiology and tracking health outcomes for communities across the Arctic. And that certainly has its place in the world of research. Like, we need to understand the epidemiology of diseases in order to treat them and address them. But one of the main challenges with only focusing on monitoring and assessment is that you're only telling a very small part of the story. You're not necessarily looking at all of the multifaceted, multi-layered determinants of health. And so what we did in the second cohort of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative was really focus on the areas that are underneath the iceberg. They're the parts of the iceberg that you don't see that we really need to focus on. And we identified three main areas. One was community and regional context. So really bringing the health research from the epidemiological level and very highly focused on Western science into communities where the communities were driving the health research and what kinds of questions got asked and how they got asked. And community-driven research approaches across the Arctic are in, I would say, a state of transition, which I think is great. Like you see in North America, in Alaska and Canada, of a very strong focus on working with Indigenous communities and having community-centered Indigenous research projects that involve Indigenous scholars, that use Indigenous research methodologies, and are really grounded in community as opposed to being focused and housed in academia. That isn't happening as much in the Nordic countries and Russia and in Greenland and Iceland and the Faroe Islands. So we're really hoping in the third iteration of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative that the scholars choose to take up these concepts and ideas of how to really make research grounded in community. And then we also focused on and really thought it was important moving into the future to use qualitative methods and Indigenous research methodologies to understand what the determinants of health really are. Because what you have seen historically in the Arctic are Western scientists that are outsiders from the Arctic communities, especially the Indigenous Arctic communities, coming in and overlaying their Western methods with collecting data from Indigenous communities, as opposed to engaging communities in the Arctic with what's the best way to collect data and what kind of knowledge do we need to really improve health equity and reduce health disparities in the Arctic. Okay, next slide, Greg. Greg, are you there? Okay, great, thanks. So we had four main areas that for our policy recommendations around health for the Arctic moving into the future. And the first one was to acknowledge and integrate Indigenous rights and knowledge. And this really comes out of UNDRIP and the Declaration for Indigenous Rights. And again, we see differences across the Arctic related to this in countries, you know, like the US and in Canada. There's a very strong focus on Indigenous rights and the ethics of Indigenous research and ensuring that Indigenous voices and Indigenous peoples and communities are in control of the research that happens in their communities and have ownership over the research, ownership over the funding, and ownership over the data and how and when that data gets shared. That North American model in the Arctic is not, again, as prominent in the European Arctic and in Greenland, as well as in Russia. So there are some areas where we definitely need to work more in the Arctic to ensure that Indigenous rights and knowledge are prominent in the research, particularly the health research. And an example of that is with the Sami in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. in those countries and in those Sami communities, they're in different spaces right now around addressing their indigenous rights to have ownership over research. And certainly the Sami parliament in Norway has been working on it a little bit longer and is a little bit farther along than what you see in Finland, which are in Finland right now, they're actively working on how do they develop indigenous Sami codes of ethics for research with Sami people in Finland. And then in Sweden, there's not as much dialogue, although there is some around the importance of having indigenous ethical guidelines for Sami people in Finland. We also thought that it would be important to highlight taking meaningful action to address indigenous determinants of health. And again, I think this is in process. You'll read a lot in the literature on health outcomes and health research in the Arctic with indigenous people about integrating indigenous knowledge and indigenous research methods. And I think, you know, we've seen that increase over the past 10 years about the importance of that. But I think in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years, that really needs to be the norm. Like still in the Arctic, in the research world and in health, the norm is still Western science. And you overlay that with indigenous communities, and maybe you have some components of indigenous knowledge or indigenous methods, but it's not the norm and it's not the standard. And we would really like to see that flipped so that the standard of health research in the Arctic is from and grounded in an indigenous lens. We obviously, we still believe in that we have to have monitoring and assessment programs because you always have to track diseases, and certainly the pandemic around the globe has highlighted the need that it's important to have that epi data so you know what's going on with diseases and health outcomes. But we were recommending and hoping that moving into the future, researchers can start to engage in maybe more social epidemiology and cultural epidemiology, where they're really tracking the cultural perspectives and the cultural outcomes to health. And then finally, we feel that in the future, using community-centered, community-engaged research approaches that are innovative and new, like multi-level designs, mixed method designs, research will be the wave of the future in the Arctic, because we have such good grounding in our monitoring and assessment and in our methodology. We're really at a place where we can start to be creative and start to integrate and work with communities so that communities are at the forefront of the approaches to reduce health disparities in the Arctic moving into the future. Second slide, or third slide. So Greg and I wanted to talk with you about the third cohort, which will be starting here in March of this year of 2021. And based on the first two cohorts, the third cohort themes are going to be Arctic security and cooperation, Arctic infrastructure in a changing environment, and community dimensions of health. And the Arctic security and cooperation theme, and there'll be a group of scholars in the third cohort working specifically on Arctic security and cooperation, really highlights, I think, what Greg was saying in the beginning about these multilateral, this multilateral history of working and sharing together in the Arctic. And we certainly have seen, like with climate change and shifting population dynamics and shifts in energy and access to energy, and shifts in like just global perspectives on security, that we need to be working together in the Arctic to make sure that we have human health security, financial security, economic security. Like there's a whole host of issues around security that have not really been addressed from a multilateral, multi-nation perspective. I'm going to let Greg talk about the Arctic infrastructure in a changing environment, because I think that's his jam more than it is mine. That's his area of expertise.
Yeah, you bet, Beth. And that one we're really excited about because we have a number of scholars uh, everywhere from Canada to Denmark to Alaska, and working on the issue of both energy security, of course, in how to enhance energy security at a local level, but also looking at it in terms of the um, built environment. In these are things like housing and so forth that are so deadly important as part of energy sinks, and connecting that up to um, economic development. And so this is what we're hoping to stitch these kind of things together. You know, one of the things that we're hoping to accomplish in Fulbright Arctic Initiative 3 cohort is actually linking across the 3 cohorts. So things like the built infrastructure, energy, housing, and so on, how does that play into community determinants of health? How do things that are operating, say, at Arctic Council level around security, whether it's search and rescue, of course, our Arctic Council has developed a treaty around that, but other areas, how do those play into things like energy security and community dimensions of health? So that's where, anyhow, that's the focus of that infrastructure in a changing environment. I'll turn it back to Beth.
So with the community dimensions of health group in the 3rd cohort, what we were hoping to accomplish, again, based on the 1st and 2nd cohort, was what you see a lot of in health research is a focus on the individual and addressing individual health through, maybe improving decision-making skills or communication skills. And you see less of working with communities and having the community be the unit of identity and the unit of analysis in health research studies in the Arctic. So we're in the 3rd cohort, we're really emphasizing in the community dimensions of health group, looking at health through a community lens, not an individual lens. It's about the health of the whole community, and the part of the philosophy around this is just what we know about the Arctic is how there's a collective consciousness and an understanding that you need the collective to survive and to prosper and to be healthy. And Greg certainly also has talked about like just that transnational sharing that historically went on in Arctic indigenous communities and other Arctic communities pre-colonialism that that we can learn from. So that's the third group. And then Greg, you want to turn to the last slide. So Greg and I wanted to acknowledge the scholars from our 1st and 2nd cohorts. I also want to say that the co-lead scholars for the 1st and 2nd cohort were Ross Virginia and Mike Svarga, and they were amazing co-scholars for both Greg and I, and really instrumental in getting this program up and running, as was the Fulbright Canada. We also want to acknowledge the other Fulbright commissions across the Arctic, because there are 8 in total that have really put their hard work, their passion for the Arctic. They've done lots of fundraising, lots of promotion of the program. So we really want to acknowledge them as well. And I think that's it for our presentation.